This is a meeting of the DPW Committee to discuss a agreement with Verizon for small cells. I'm joined by Councilor Joe Driscoll, Council President Helen Hudson, I'm Councilor at Large Michael Green, and Councilor Tim Rudd. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves and then just start by giving us context of kind of how we reached this point and a broad overview of where we are.
Thank you, councilors. So I'm Sam Edelstein. I'm the city's chief data officer.
Mary Robison, city engineer.
We may have one other joining us. We also have representatives from Verizon Wireless here who can answer any specific questions that you have relative to the technology or their plans. But I'll just start off with the opening statement. So we're here to present a proposed agreement with Verizon Wireless focused on small cell wireless facilities in the city's right-of-way. If approved, this agreement would lead to Syracuse being one of the first cities in the country to have 5G technology deployed. We have discussed this technology in the past and are here to present you additional information and answer your questions today. Additionally, Verizon Wireless representatives are here in the audience. So small cell wireless facilities enable the deployment of next generation wireless technology, including 5G. The potential for this technology, while still very much new, is huge. Reports on the use cases for the technology include things like enabling autonomous and connected vehicles, allowing for augmented reality, so imagine visualizing underground infrastructure without needing to actually dig into the road. Control of remote devices, so again, imagine fixing a broken water main instead of actually at the site, but using a robot to do it and controlling that robot from the water department. Enhanced broadband connectivity, remote educational opportunities, and visualing fire incidents or something similar in real time from drone footage taken from above. 5G enables these types of use cases because the tubes that it goes through, essentially, they're high speed, they offer low latency and large data transmission capacity. As you know, the city has purchased all of the streetlights in the city, and they will be upgraded to LED over the course of the next year. Additionally, the city has been named New York State's flagship smart city. This agreement is separate from both of those facts, though the streetlight upgrades and connectivity both focus on using technology in hopefully positive ways. The streetlights in smart cities can happen without small cells, and small cells could happen without streetlights and smart cities. So you may ask today why it's important for Syracuse to be the first or one of the first cities to have 5G and small cell in the city. Based on the potential of the technology, which will complement the mayor's surge vision, we believe that having high-speed wireless connectivity in Syracuse will be an economic development driver. We heard from businesses and community partners that connectivity is critical for their growth, and leading the adoption of 5G will provide our burgeoning tech sector a competitive advantage. Additionally, it was Verizon Wireless that approached the city here with this plan and agreement. So they see a benefit of rolling it out in Syracuse as one of the first as well, and they can speak to that if you're interested. The city has expressed some larger priorities related to digital equity here, knowing that the lack of connectivity and high rates of poverty are highly correlated. Additionally, knowing that the future of work will likely depend on some level of connectivity means that prioritizing access to internet across the city is critical. So it's a priority for us, obviously. There are some questions that we assume you'll have in this meeting that we would like to just address up front. Additionally, the Verizon Wireless representatives can address any of these questions in more depth. So one of the questions is, how does the FCC order impact this agreement? While the FCC order certainly placed limits on the ability for municipalities to create many of their own rules related to fees for small cell wireless facilities, we have done our best to work within the confines of this order to come to an agreement here. We also have published our small cell wireless facility aesthetic requirements online, and any small cells placed would need to follow those guidelines. Additionally, should there be any changes to the FCC order, there are opportunities to renegotiate the terms. Will this technology be available citywide? Our intention is to ensure that everybody has equitable access to technology and connectivity in the city. And while the city itself is not executing this project, so we are somewhat limited in what we can require, we have made clear to Verizon Wireless our vision and have reflected that desire in the agreement itself. How are health concerns being addressed? The FCC order has its own requirements around health implications that this agreement takes into account. Additionally, this agreement requires regular testing by Verizon Wireless and allows the city to do its own testing. We think there's a lot of promise in this technology and have worked to put together an agreement that Verizon Wireless has agreed to. There are many details that we are sure you would like to discuss, and we will do our best to answer your questions, or we'll ask Verizon Wireless representatives to answer those questions where appropriate. So open to anything that you have a question on.
You want to start?
Well, again, when we get to digital equity, I get that everyone has good intentions, but what's the game plan? I mean, maybe we could hear from Verizon. I think we've had we've had the stories come out that 1 in 4 people in the Syracuse area don't have access to internet technology. They don't have access. So my hope was, when the original discussion was around the streetlights and this being interconnected to it, was that we could get some kind of digital equity in this city that would reach these 1 in 4 that do not have access. So does anybody have any further plans beyond good intent?
And if I can piggyback, because that's my question too,
Yeah.
because I'm like you, if that's a priority for the city, is it actually going to be a priority for Verizon, and what's the time frame?
Would you like to speak from it? Yes, please join us.
Thank you. My name is Mark Kuhn. I am with Verizon Wireless Upstate New York Network Engineering, and with me today is Greg Hanley. Greg has a long background as an RF engineer. He also works for Upstate New York Network Engineering. Eric Reed. Eric is the lead for external affairs in the East region for Verizon, and Rob Brenner is our legal counsel. So first, before answering your question, I just want to compliment the city on doing the hard work to be ready for small cells, to address small cells, because they're certainly crucial to providing much needed data capacity relief. We're seeing 50% data growth rates on our network year over year in upstate New York. And as Sam spoke about, they're the key infrastructure for 5G, for next generation of wireless networks. And the fact that, the city should also be complimented with its policies that it's putting in place to leverage technology and wireless networks for opportunities for innovation and for economic development. And that's something, as the Syracuse Surge Initiative, it's something that really motivated Verizon to work with the city to negotiate this agreement. So to answer your question about digital equity, this agreement does put into place the framework that will allow us to deploy in all neighborhoods across the city. And in fact, that is what our plan is to do. And we are, just as an example, the very first projects that we have keyed up ready to go, if this goes into effect, and actually I'm going to ask Greg to come up, because Greg can describe the geographic areas that we plan to cover with the very first projects that we'll work on right off the bat.
I'm going to use my phone because I don't have all the streets memorized. I do apologize.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
We're going to have 2 clusters initially in the city of Syracuse. The first one I kind of call the southwest. It's bordered by, on the east is 81. So from 81 heading west up to 690, over to approximately West Street. And then all this is going to be inside this area. So West Street south, down to where it hits Onondaga Boulevard, and it's going to kind of follow the creek all the way down. I think it's Martin Luther King, that area, and then over again to 81. So that wedge in there is the first cluster. The second cluster, again, it's northeast of 81 and 690, actually James Street, really. So where James Street goes under 690, that'll be kind of the southeast border, all the way up to, I think it's, what is it here? Sedgwick. Sedgwick Drive. It'll kind of follow Sedgwick all the way up to Grant, and then across Grant down to 298, and then we're basically where 298 almost hits 81. That'll be the southwestern border. So those two sections are going to be the first wave. The years after, it'll expand from there in an outward motion.
And your goal is to have full coverage of the entire city.
Eventually, yes, that is the goal. Correct.
So if another, as I understand it, it's not an exclusive agreement, right? So if another company were to come in, would they have to go through the same process of, is that how, I'm trying to remember how 5-cell works. So people could share,
Yes,
they'd share poles and locations, but they'd have separate cells in the locations, is that correct, or?
Joe Barry, First Assistant Corporation Counsel.
Mr. Berry?
In order for another carrier to have a citywide permission such as this, they would need to enter into a similar agreement approved by the council. And we would, our intent is to use this as kind of the model template going forward.
Okay.
So kind of,
Just gonna add one thing on your question about being able to share poles. Yes, we can locate on the same poles as other providers. That's technically feasible too.
Which you're the first one.
One other point on the digital equity question. We do already have small cells deployed in the city of Syracuse on private property, like on rooftops.
Okay.
And we do in fact have them in every single council district within the city. So we've already taken steps to, provide service in every neighborhood essentially, but this will allow us to a more expedited manner, more efficient manner
Right.
to densify our network.
so when you talk about expanding it, what's a ballpark timeline of that, and what are the kind of metrics you're looking at to say, okay, this is what's going to cause us to keep moving forward, or conversely, what would be a situation where you would say we're done building here, it's over?
Well, I can't see that situation coming up because, like I said, the agreement does provide the framework to have a clear path to continue the build out throughout the city, throughout all neighborhoods. The only thing that I would see if something goes sideways on implementation of the agreement, but I don't foresee that happening.
Okay. And then, so from a timeline perspective, what's a realistic ballpark of that?
So
Yeah.
this first phase is 101 nodes. I think our engineers, when they did their first go-through, it was approximately 600 nodes that would be required to cover the entire city footprint. 100 this year. What we're going to get for a budget next year, we don't know, and we probably won't know until August. So I really can't predict, a timeline. But let's just say if it was 100 nodes per year, within 6 years, we would have the entire city covered with 5G. And that's not to say, like, headquarters may come back and say, can you do more? Can you double your nodes next year? And obviously, when they come back and make those statements to us, as long as we have these agreements in place, we're going to raise our hand and say, yeah, we can do 200, 300, and shorten that timeline up considerably.
As the upstate network team, we will advocate to build out as quick as we can.
And you said you already have small cells deployed on private property in everybody's council district.
That's correct.
So does that mean that there's access now for some of those communities?
Because all of those small cells required private property leases, and it's a very slow process to do this on private property. They're basically, they're covering hotspots. They're not providing ubiquitous coverage. They were just put in certain hotspots where we see concentrated groups of users.
Okay.
So no, it does not provide the, what you're thinking of at the time being.
Okay. And then I have one more question, because receiving emails from constituents, and they're basically telling us to vote no. They're basically, they have health concerns. So can you answer some of those? They're saying it's gonna cause cancer.
Yeah.
So
I can try to answer these questions. So
Can I just, so like, for instance, I had one open, like one of them is like, 5G is a technology that emits large amounts of electromagnetic frequencies. These cause cancer, DNA breakage, altered brain development, immune system disruption, insomnia, memory loss, and blah, blah, blah.
right? So, yeah, I'll try to answer those questions. First of all, there's two different types of radiation, ionizing and non-ionizing. Ionizing radiation is the one that breaks up cells and on a molecular level. We work in non-ionizing, so that's just right out of the window. The FCC sets up standards for RF safety and RF emissions. They've been doing studies
RF
for the
is
past...
radio frequency?
What's that?
RF is
Yeah,
radio
radio frequency, I'm sorry. They've been doing these studies for decades. I've been in the industry 20 years. They were doing it probably 10 years before I was. The frequencies, the actual frequencies being used vary. You know, there's 600 megahertz, 800, 700, all the way up to 28 gig. But those standards were put in place based on research by scientists in the United States of America and across the world, again, over the course of several decades. And what they found is, as long as you operate with inside those standards, there is no known health issues that they have found over the course of 30 years, let's say. Verizon Wireless has to operate with inside those standards. We cannot get permission to turn up a site if we say we're going to be operating above those standards. Every site that we activate, we have to prove that we're going to be below those standards. And the standards that the FCC has implemented in the United States of America are very conservative compared to some of the standards that are implemented in other countries. So they're stricter across the world. Those standards have wide margins of safety, so they cover everybody, including children. And the last part I'll kind of say about it is Verizon has a comprehensive RF safety program. We take pride that we study every single site to make sure that it's not going to be above those standards. And I believe, as Sam said, in the agreement, we put in place that we would be able to go out and we would do testing. The city could say to us, we'd like you to test these 10 sites and prove to us, now that they're live and on the air, that your RF emissions are below the FCC standards, and we will do that. And then the city can also recommend which sites. So they, you know, they're not just going to say, hey, do 10 sites. They can say, we want you to do this site, and this site to prove that you're within compliance.
And is there going to be any type of reporting to you guys once this is all put together?
Yes, that is included in the agreement.
Okay.
On the one more thing to make on the RF question, the radio frequency safety, we do have materials that we'd be glad to share with you that maybe could help you answer questions that your constituents have. There's great, I'll call it third-party resource. You know, the American Cancer Society has information on their website about RF exposure. Many other organizations like that, health-related organizations.
send that to us, it
So
would
we'd
be
love to
appreciated.
share that information with you.
Thank you.
You mentioned within the allowable standards and all of that, and then how I think standards are different across countries. So like this one presentation that we were sent, it has all these references to municipalities in Brussels, Belgium, Rome, municipalities like not allowing it for allowable radiation levels or something like that. So how would you, how should somebody like me who gets this kind of thing react to that type of information?
So yeah, like I was trying to get across, the FCC has worked with scientists in several countries. Our governing body is the FCC. Not because we want to look at, they want to be able to say, well, we didn't just work with scientists from the United States of America. They're working with people all across Europe, all across the world. And then the FCC said, okay, you know, they're looking at these studies from these scientists, and then they set up a level. There's several governing bodies in the world that make recommendations on what the levels per cubic centimeter can be. And the FCC basically said, okay, well, we're going to take a more conservative approach, and they're actually, in the United States of America, our requirements are much stricter than places like Belgium and Germany and France. So that's kind of what I was getting at when I was stating that. I think our standards are probably the most strict standards in the world.
So when you were talking, are you good, Councilor Rudd?
I'm good on that point, yeah.
Okay. When you were talking about, you guys are getting funding for the first phase for 101 nodes, and you said you don't know what the budget will be for the coming years. What determines that? I mean, for example, if I was Verizon and I was looking at, oh, let's get in there and fund the second phase as soon as possible, what would determine whether you guys are eager to push it forward as fast as possible, or if there might be a lag in the second phase?
Right, so what pushes that is basically us. If we've got a great working relationship with the municipality, we have these agreements in place, then we're gonna basically go and say, hey, we can do as much as you'll allow us to do. Obviously, Verizon is a big company, right? So they have budgets that they have to, take into consideration. I'm not sure what the budget nationwide is for 5G rollout, but they may have in mind cities that they want to roll out, and they may end up saying, guess what, we don't have an agreement with that city. So then we can apply to put in for more sites to do next year. We're always gonna go in with a maximum, so like I said, if we know that we're doing 100 this year, and if we have this agreement in place, we're gonna tell them, we can do 500 next year. They know that we have an agreement with the city of Syracuse, and then they're gonna take into consideration at the headquarters level, what other cities are we targeting, what other cities do we have these agreements with, and then they allocate us our budget based on that information. But we're the advocates, like Mark said. We were the advocates for this right here. We basically went in and told our folks at headquarters, hey, we're working with the city, we have some great relationships forming, we want to be able to do 5G in the city of Syracuse this year. And they said, okay, we'll give you the capability to do that if you get this agreement put in place.
And we know that we have AT&T and Sprint and all these other folks, right?
Yep.
Are you concerned about oversaturation?
Not on a technical standpoint, no. They have their own frequencies. We have our own frequencies. They have their customers. We have ours. We spoke about this when we went over and created the aesthetic guidelines that the city just put in place. We really talked about how many nodes do we want on a pole. Does it make sense to have?
Okay, how many do you want on a pole?
Yeah, how many nodes would be on a pole? Does it make sense to have all three carriers on the same telephone pole? Or does it maybe make sense visually, Verizon's on one pole, the next pole is 150 feet down the street, 100 feet, AT&T's on that one, maybe T-Mobile's on a different one. In the end, our networks are never gonna align perfectly, because they just don't. We have sites where AT&T doesn't have sites, they have sites where we don't have sites. And managing that footprint is what's gonna happen with this rollout. So oversaturation to me is not gonna be, it's not gonna hinder any of the carriers, and it's definitely not gonna hinder the residents.
So how many nodes are on a pole?
It all depends.
Okay,
I mean, basically, we're gonna put 3 nodes on a pole as our standard design, so it covers in 3 different directions, 120-degree pie slices, basically. And that depends too on topology, urban clutter, things of that nature.
that's my concern, okay.
Sam did a good job describing how our light investment is largely separate of this. It can happen without 5G. 5G can happen without that. So this is another level, I guess. But so net neutrality, we don't have net neutrality now. Does 5G in any way connect to, like, does that work better in a world without net neutrality? Or if that ever were to change again, does 5G roll out? I don't know. I'm asking as a pretty much layman person. Like, isn't it, because in the end, we're all going to be paying to access the internet, right?
Yeah, I don't see an impact on how that would affect our rollout of 5G.
So one of the things Sam touched upon is, your decision to have Syracuse be one of the first places. Can you want to talk a little bit about that as to why Syracuse is a place you think could be successful?
Well, yeah, as I touched on in the opening comments, I mean, we just see we've seen the policies that Syracuse is putting in place. We saw the fact that you rescinded the ordinance that was previously put into effect in order to meet the the guidelines of the new FCC order. Just the whole Syracuse Surge initiative is so exciting. Especially, I love when your mayor talks about the fourth industrial revolution, because cities like Syracuse, they really benefited from the early stages of the industrial revolution. But then, third industrial revolution, that was like the digital information age. A lot of jobs, a lot of economic activity went to places like Silicon Valley. And this fourth industrial revolution is really an opportunity for cities like Syracuse to get back in the game. So just like I said, just the policies that the city is espousing and the Syracuse Surge initiative, we saw it as a good good way to build a relationship between the city and Verizon, and I'm sure other wireless companies would want to do the same. So it's really like I said, it just has to do with the fact with the policies that the city is putting in place.
And then, for 5G, it's something that's a new technology. For the average person, can be a little hard to kind of wrap their head around what the tangible impacts of it would be. Sam touched upon a little bit from the municipal level of manhole, work.
Yep.
But can you talk a little bit more about what sort of advantages this could give City of Syracuse in terms of private investment, in terms of businesses, in terms of other things that the average person can say, this is going to impact my life in this way?
Yeah. So, everybody, obviously they initially they focus on smartphones, and that's because that's what we're using now. The real opportunity with 5G is beyond phones. Phones are just going to be one of thousands of devices that are connected. There's the term you may have heard, the Internet of Things, which is just referring to all these other sensors and devices that are going to connect to wireless networks of the future. And quite honestly, that's the job of the innovators and the inventors to, down the line, come up with more ways to use wireless networks and affect the way people live, work, and play. So a lot of that remains to be seen, but it's definitely a new age that's coming, a new, like I said, that fourth industrial revolution. So just the ability to have all those connected devices and the power of innovation that'll bring.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to what Mark was saying, that people usually think when you talk about a device, they're just used to like their phone or their iPad. But with 5G, it's going to be so much more. And Mark said the word sensor. We're hearing from these innovators and these inventors that they're going to be able to put sensors into wearable items, a watch or a medical device from the hospital, fall detection for elderly people. They're talking about sensors in parking meters, street lights, gunshot detectors, the security cameras, water meters in your home, your refrigerators, your TVs. Part of the 5G standard, they call them the currencies, is to be able to service 1 million connected devices per square kilometer. So it's not 1 million residents in the city of Syracuse, but with 5G, you'll be able to service 1 million devices per square kilometer. And that's where we start talking about, let's get our heads away from the phones and the iPads and think more about all these sensors that are going to be embedded in all these things, and they're all going to be connected to help automate, our cities and our country.
Can I ask one more question? Yes? Okay. I don't know, quite a few may not have been here, but I was here when Verizon came in and Sprint came in, everybody came in together. And Sprint offered up some type of they didn't exactly say what it would be, community benefit. Do you guys do any type of community benefits for the more underserved communities?
Not sure, without knowing what they were offering, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not familiar.
I'll go back in my notes and I'll get in touch with you.
Yeah, that'd be great, and we can give you a response for sure.
Okay.
Is there anything in the agreement that penalizes Verizon if you start to build 5G and then you stop in the poor neighborhoods? So we just did it like Fios 10 years ago, where we get it in downtown in Sedgwick, but not the rest of the city.
No, there isn't.
Is that even possible within the framework of the FCC to have that type of thing? Or is the FCC language such that we're not allowed to put in place
Yeah,
those types of things?
I'll defer to the attorneys on that question.
Yeah.
Hi, Rob Brenner, outside counsel to Verizon. I'd defer to Joe and his thoughts as well, but I think it's problematic because it could rise potentially to the level of an effective prohibition. If the city is indicating where facilities need to be constructed, if they're not constructed in connection with need and demand on the infrastructure, we'd need to respond first to need and demand, also building out under that architectural plan of covering the whole city. So it really needs to be a balanced tandem approach. I think there is issues under the FCC order, but I'd defer to Joe.
Yeah, I agree with Rob, and that's really why we had to rescind our previous 2017 general ordinance, because the FCC order that went into effect this past January really limits local government's ability to regulate on that level.
So with need and demand, your need and your demand will be in the higher business income areas.
So that not necessarily.
Yeah, so I've got the background because I appeared before the Planning Commission almost every month when we were doing rooftop deployments, and we were doing them, as Mark and Greg indicated during their presentation, in all areas of the city. And it was responding not necessarily to business or economic need, but actual need on the network by users. So we were doing them in residential neighborhoods of all demographic. We were doing them in commercial districts of all demographics throughout the entirety of the city. And it was actually a directive at that time by the Planning Commission chairman and Jeff Harrop on staff saying, guys, we don't like seeing these on buildings. What can you do to get in the right of way? We want to continue to see you deploy in the neighborhoods that you're deploying, but we need them in the right of way. So deployment, when I say need, isn't necessarily tied to business or economic need. It's tied to really the need of the folks using their devices and dialing a call out or texting someone, and it could be anywhere in the city.
So one of my questions is, it seems like it could be a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing where people don't have access to information or digital equity right now, so therefore you wouldn't notice there's a need for it because it doesn't currently exist. So how does that resolve itself?
So, yeah, I'll try to hit on it. So luckily, on the 4G side of the ball, we do have continuous coverage throughout the city of Syracuse. And those sites are reporting metrics back to us every second. And our traffic engineers and our RF engineers can see where that usage demand is. So based on our current 4G network, which is long-term evolution, it's not as fast at data rates as 5G, it doesn't have the amount of capacity, doesn't have the latency, but we can take good assumptions on that to know where we're going to be able to put, or where we're going to need to put additional capacity for the 5G network once the 5G stuff is deployed. And just one other thing to add on to this too, I know when we were discussing this stuff with Sam and his team, we were looking for feedback from them on what are areas of the city that you would like to see us deploy in. And if it's not in our first wave, can we go there for part of our second wave? So we are working with the city to try to identify, the next best places to develop. One thing I can say for Verizon, looking at some of the stuff from the other cities outside of New York State, is they are deploying more in residential areas than they are the downtown areas for 5G. We're really targeting the residential areas as opposed to the downtown core steel, concrete type areas.
So we can't tell you, but we can suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. Me as an RF engineer, when I was an RF engineer, that's the type of information I wanted. I'd love to hear that feedback from the city and say, hey, we need help in this area. Then I could target that, and I could tell my folks at headquarters, these guys want more service in this area. And we, again, as advocates for the city, we push that information up to our headquarters folks.
So, sorry, this is probably, you mind if I hop in, Mike?
Yeah, go for it.
This is kind of more a fundamental comprehension of how this works. So this might be like, 101 basic here. I'm trying to just get a grasp on everything. So the cells, they're not, is this laptop as well? The service that comes out? So this is like, how does the user get charged? How do you measure, how do you measure the usage of the frequency and all that stuff? You know what I mean? Before, when it was more of like a modem type apparatus, if this is coming from a pole, how do you as Verizon measure who's utilizing and how they get charged and which devices and all that kind of stuff? That's just like kind of, I don't know if that's, super fundamental, but it's kind of confusing me a little bit.
Don't worry. It's confusing to everybody. So
You want to just come a little closer to the mic? You
yep.
get further
In essence, it'll be the same. Each, we'll call it a sensor or device or a laptop or an iPad. It'll have what you call an ESN, which is an electronic serial number associated with it. They may call it something different, but back when I was doing engineering, that's what it was called.
Uh-huh.
And that's basically how they track how much usage that device is doing. So a laptop will have some sort of a card in it that's 5G capable. An iPad will have something in it to make it 5G capable. The phones, the sensors on the light poles, the parking meters, and your refrigerator. They'll all have RF receivers and transmitters in them that are devices that get attached to our network. And then we can tell, obviously, how much usage is being done by those devices.
Do our current devices have the 5G capability?
No, not
So
they don't.
this will be in the devices that are coming out within the next year or
Yeah,
two.
there's
will have
devices.
5G.
There's devices out right now. I can't remember. Motorola makes one, and they have an add-on thing. It's the one that you're hearing about in Chicago and in Minneapolis. But this year, there's going to be many more 5G capable devices released by Verizon Wireless and probably by our competitors as well. And basically, it's just another chipset that goes in the phone. So right now, this is the big thing that's on all the phone manufacturers' minds. Anybody who's making any type of a smart anything is having a chipset in that that's capable of using 5G into the future.
And your networks would be private then, correct? So no one can utilize this signal without previous consent, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, just making sure I understand it completely.
Yep. And again, those phone manufacturers, these chipsets that they build them so they can work, with obviously on our network, AT&T's network, T-Mobile's network, Sprint's network. They have different frequencies, but each carrier, their phone manufacturers will have the chipsets in those phones that'll work on those networks.
I just have one last comment. I try to keep my tinfoil hat in my house and not wear it in public. But I do think this highlights the need for trust and trusting different levels of government and trusting corporations. And I don't know that we always have great trust in our society anymore. So I will sit here and I will choose to believe that the government at the state and national levels and private industry has done due diligence, and that we're not, and that our eagerness from being left out of previous, let's call them economic revolutions, is not pushing us to expose ourselves to undue harm, because as a counselor, it's hard to figure all that out. So I think we simply do have to have trust, and that's what I'm gonna do on all of this. But I hope I never regret it. So I don't know. Thank you. That's all I have.
One last question. I was kind of wondering regarding, so a lot of the problem with the other equity, I'd imagine that this is, I was just curious to get we know that laying fiber wire could be quite cost intensive. There's a lot of infrastructure built out there. I'd imagine this is much less of a heavy lift, and that perhaps that would, when we're having the conversation about equity, I'd imagine that the hurdle isn't as high because of the kind of more simplistic nature of attaching something to a pole rather than having to dig through the ground and do that kind of stuff. So could you kind of speak to to that aspect of how big of a lift you might imagine 5G might be as opposed to the past?
Yeah, so when you talk about, bringing internet into a home, the biggest thing that we've all heard for the past 5 years is the last mile is the most expensive part of the whole network. Getting from that street into somebody's home is the most expensive part of deploying either Fios or cable or any type of internet service that's wired. With us, we're wireless from that telephone into their home, okay? We don't have to dig up their front yard and put some sort of a cable under the ground and drill a hole into their basement wall to bring that service in. Now, I'm not saying that lightens our lift, because Verizon is investing a lot of money in 5G, not only on the wireless side, but also building out fiber on the landline side as well. Because as you said, there are areas that don't have fiber that we're going to want to put nodes in that they have to bring fiber into for us.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Sorry, I don't know if I fully grasped that.
Yeah, so obviously underneath all the sidewalks everywhere in the city of Syracuse or on the poles, there's not fiber everywhere, okay? We do need fiber in order to make our 5G nodes work. They have to communicate back to our switching centers, okay? So they have to bring fiber in. Some sort of a fiber provider has to bring fiber in for us to make these nodes work. So there will, so that's again another lift, that people often don't think about because you're talking to the wireless guys. We also have to worry about that fiber infrastructure as well.
So the nodes don't operate without a fiber system.
Correct.
With which to play
Correct.
off of.
Yep, correct. That's one of the big things with 5G that you'll hear Verizon say a lot. There's 3 things that are required for 5G: fiber, a dense small cell network, and large spectrum holdings, and we have all 3.
What's the last one?
Large spectrum holdings. So we have a very large amount of bandwidth that we're going to be able to deploy 5G on. So I hope I kind of answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did very much so. It was very educational.
One quick question, it might sound a little, is 5G even here yet?
So yes, just last month we launched 5G, the mobile 5G, the 3GPP compliant 5G in Chicago and Minneapolis. And then last year in 2018, we launched it in 4 cities, and it was a Verizon standard, not the engineering 3GPP standard, and that was basically Verizon Home. It was still transmitting the same frequencies, using the fiber networking. It's all wireless from the street into the home, but it was a home service only. The mobile devices didn't have a chipset that works on that technology. So we're live in 4 markets with 5G Home, and we're live in 2 markets with 5G ultra wideband, and last week they just released 20 more markets that'll be built out with 5G ultra wideband by the end of 2019.
So does everything we have become obsolete now, or do we have to upgrade to all the 5G stuff?
No, it doesn't become obsolete. Our 4G network is not going anywhere. It's going to be here for years and years to come. I've been with Verizon for 20 years as of last month. When I started here, we had analog and we had CDMA, our digital, which was basically for voice. We still have CDMA on the air on our sites. Analog was turned off in 2008. That's the only technology that I've seen sunsetted in doing wireless stuff for 22 years. So things won't be obsolete, but what you'll see is typical for any type of wireless carrier. When something new comes out, you'll start seeing in the stores 1 or 2 devices that'll have this new technology, and you'll see 30 other devices that still have the stuff we've been selling for the last 10 years. And then as the years go along, you'll start seeing more and more of the 5G stuff, in the stores, and less of the
Just can't put the
4G.
chip in here?
We can try, but I can't guarantee anything. I'm always open for trying, But, the good thing is Verizon is a big company, again, and we work with those manufacturers to really drive down the costs on those handsets. So when somebody comes in, it's not going to be a huge uptick in price. I mean, an iPhone costs $1,000.
Yeah, that's
that's a huge cost. But there will be 5G chipsets and phones that don't cost $1,000. So we work with those manufacturers.
Right.
There you go. I don't know if they're going to be on the flip phones though. Maybe.
Hey, do I look like a flip card?
I did have a follow-up to Councilor Driscoll's point about the fiber. It may be just a coincidence, but you also have on your upcoming agenda a request from First Light of Albany to have a citywide agreement for fiber installation. And I think they may go hand in hand to the extent, I don't know if you have any plans to use First Light, or if that's just they're just doing their own thing. But
I think that's a coincidence. It must be. The fiber for our network would be Verizon Telephone, the incumbent local phone company, has the right of first refusal to do the fiber backhaul installations for Verizon Wireless, the Verizon Wireless network. So it may, but I mean, there's a lot of activity in the telecommunications space right now, so it doesn't surprise me to hear that, you know, that this agreement that you refer to is on the docket too.
and that's for fiber only, so that's the distinction, yeah.
And can I ask you guys a question while you're here? Because about 5 years ago, you weren't interested in doing fiber all the way throughout. So now there's a change in heart here to bring fiber through the whole city now. And that's because you need it for your 5G, huh? Because I know I called in.
Yeah, that's right. And again, so Verizon Telephone, the incumbent phone company, is basically a sister company to Verizon Wireless. So I can't speak to what happened with the fiber build out, but as Greg mentioned, there's that last mile cost, and which is a bottleneck for fiber to the home. But the wireless network helps alleviate some of that last mile cost. So if that answers your question, I think that.
Sort of. So
yeah.
the fiber build out you're going to do is not going to be the fiber build out
No.
for the home.
No, it's
what you're doing.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Yep.
But you said that, so if I can understand, so the 5G, the nodes need the fiber optics in order to function. So if I'm in a house that doesn't have fiber optics in the house, I can still utilize the 5G node if there's fiber optics at a house nearby or something?
No,
Is that-
the fiber optics, think of it, so the really, I mean, we refer to it as a wireless network, but the only part that's wireless is from the cell site or the node to the user device. Whether that user device is a laptop or a smartphone or a street light sensor, that's the wireless portion from the user device to the node or the cell site. Mm-hmm. The node or the cell site is then connected back to the backbone network through a fiber optic connection. So every small cell that we install will be, just think of it as connected back to the main network,
Right.
with a fiber optic strand.
So I guess so the node itself has to be connected back to the fiber optic
Correct.
network. But
Correct.
does the user?
No.
Okay, so that does.
So that's how
That's
that
how
last
you-
mile
that's how you
cost
miss
is
that last
alleviated.
mile
Right,
cost,
right.
because if the node is going back to the fiber optics, it's not necessarily that each house within the radius of the
Right.
node be connected to the fiber
That's right.
optics. Oh, that's good. So that'll help a lot, right? As
Yep.
far as our goal for equity and coverage of the city, that'll probably help a lot, right?
That's right.
Anything else?
I think I'm good.
Sam, anything else?
Yes, in terms of Wednesday's study session, it would probably be beneficial for Verizon to come back in case other counselors have questions that
Yeah.
weren't here today.
Yeah. Okay.
Only 4 of us.
Okay.
Just wanted to note.
Okay. All right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. Please let us know when Skynet goes live.